Thanks very much for coming back. I promise that the other session, while still being data heavy, will be a bit more interesting, as we will have the results of that agency survey that you had mentioned at the beginning of this session. So stay tuned for it. But before we get there, I have some tips and tricks. We'll probably skip this one. How to evaluate as an owner of the school or a marketing director, sales director, how to leverage the existing market intelligence to look at the markets that you're present in, look at the markets where you might be present in the future, and probably look at the markets that are not growing for you any longer. I think that's equally important. So we'll do some global perspectives in more detail. We'll do some UK perspectives. I'll also talk about what I consider markets of the future, or markets where I would like to share my considerations with you, so that you have a list of markets to keep an eye on. And then we will end up with the results of the agency survey and a quick summary of the findings. So without further ado, let me go back to that top 20 source markets globally, and to demonstrate that the maturity of the sector is also present in individual performances of the key source markets. So if you look at the top 10 countries behind me, you will be able to see that only 4 markets grew year on year from 17 to 18. So we have a maturing industry, and the number of markets that are driving growth is on decrease. If you look at China, as I mentioned, this was the first year when we saw a decline in student numbers. We can only wonder to what extent it could be attributed to the developments in the Philippines, as we know that the Philippines are becoming a preferred destination of Chinese students too. When we look at Brazil, 17 was a very solid performance, and a lot of this traffic goes to Ireland. What we saw in 18 was again further growth fueled towards Ireland. We saw a small decline in Australia, so something interesting after very solid performance in 17. If we look at Japan, my personal reading of the situation is that the market did not decline year on year, because there is a proportion of students going to the Philippines. So it reinstated as the third most important market globally. Saudi Arabia, after the abolishment of the King Abdullah scholarship program, we saw a rapid decline. So that was the first major development of the last years. The second one was that we are noting a slight shift in terms of destination preference. So those students who still wanted to travel, usually self-paid students, then they opted more for the UK at the expense of the US as well as Canada recently. South Korea, the country is investing a lot of money and effort into building their own infrastructure. They're making sure that students are reaching certain level of English language proficiency to make the university entrance exams. And as a direct result of this, we see the number of student weeks from the country on a decline. Italy is the 6th largest market globally, and the largest in terms of Europe. It's probably one of the few markets for the English UK private sector membership that delivers more junior student weeks in the summer period than adults, so a very junior-driven market. Colombia is the star performer of the top 10 in terms of percentage growth. We saw gradual increases, and the 2 biggest beneficiaries of this development are Australia and Canada. Spain is, again, one of the more mature European markets. It's flattening in terms of demand, although 18 showed some signs of recovery and a slight increase in terms of student weeks. Thailand, an important ASEAN market, globally declining but posting good development for the UK. And we see Turkey on decline due to recent also political circumstances. This is the rest of the top 20 ranking. Ultimately, these 20 markets represent some 86% of the global student mobility. So by targeting these markets, you're actually targeting 80% of all student weeks spent in the industry. The markets are relatively similar to size, the first 5 on the slide. Vietnam used to be a very good market for the US, especially recently we saw some declines. France, Switzerland, Germany, these markets, traditionally strong European markets, continue to either flatten or decrease. So again, it is an implication for the UK as the primary destination of these students. We also saw entrance of India into the top 20 markets just recently due to being covered in Canadian data for the first time. So this year we added India for the first time. So 17 and 18 is not directly comparable. I just want you to be aware of this caveat. It hasn't been that India has grown that much, but it's because Canada started to measure the market as a standalone source country in 2018. Good development by Chile, growth, and it would be one of the markets that I would also point out to the UK to focus on. However, seeing quick data from this year, Q1 and Q2 posted declines, especially for the private sector, which is something to take note of. And a similar situation is in case of Argentina. Argentina used to be the member of this top 20 club, recently was replaced by Chile. And it posted a very good performance for the UK in 2018. However, quick data shows that due to the current economic situation in the country, there are a few students not just going to the UK, but also globally. From the UK perspective, this is the number of student weeks spent in the UK. So the ranking, the order of countries stays the same, but we would like to show you how the situation changes when we look at the UK as the recipient of the student weeks. So China, the second largest market for the UK, as I said, 2018 was the first decrease that we noted for the market. However, China continued to grow for the UK, especially for the private sector. In the state sector, in the private sector, we actually saw a minor decrease from China. Brazil maintains the levels for the UK, although there are some opportunities for further growth. Japan, very similar situation, stays as or remains as one of the most important non-EU markets for the UK. Saudi Arabia, as I said, this is the shift that we've noted, that compared to, for instance, the US or Canada, Saudi Arabia continued to grow for the UK. South Korea, the development in the UK mirrors the overall development. So the UK is not missing the train in terms of receiving few student weeks from the market. Italy, another drop after a rebound in 17 due to language courses being more accessible in the UK. And the PON scholarship scheme is definitely something to look at if you are a junior provider. Colombia, again, we saw an opposing trend in the UK compared to the global development. So despite the country growing quite fast overall, there was a decline in the number of student weeks spent in the UK. And as I commented before, Thailand, the exactly opposite development. UK managed to grow in the market, however, globally the market declined. It's also important to look at the rest of the top 20 markets. We see, again, France, Switzerland and Germany being the markets that the UK used to depend on in the past as being on decline. So these markets represent less and less opportunities for providers. On the other hand, it's still important to be present in this market, to maintain the advice would rather be to look at the product development. So what, as an industry, the UK can do in terms of doing a more sophisticated, more appealing product for these markets, as we know that the English language proficiency is on the rise, and the demand for general English is on decline. As an important KPI, when looking at the performance of a destination, we usually turn to destination market share. So again, if you recall from the previous session, we had a map of the 20 markets and UK's market share. We're also able to do this historically. So we not only look at the overall figures, but also what is the actual market size. So what kind of share of traffic is the UK attracting. And you can see that in China, the UK constantly, since 2015, improves its position, growing in terms of market share. In Brazil and Japan, the market share is relatively stable, although Japan declined a bit, but UK increased its market share, which is an interesting development. In Saudi Arabia, so as an add-on to what I've said, that we saw the destination preference shift among the students, it's also demonstrated in the increase in terms of UK's market share. South Korea, the decline in the UK is lower than in other destinations. That's why UK's market share is actually growing. And for Italy, the same. So Italy decreased more for other destinations than it did for the UK. Probably I'll skip the other slide because I'll let you dive deeper into it. But the main takeaway again is that the UK is already well established in Western European countries, and these markets, while on decline, the UK still keeps on having quite high penetration levels. So opportunities to recruit from these countries are rather limited. I want to spend more time, obviously, on the topic of diversification. As I mentioned at the end of the previous session, I think that the UK providers really need to diversify, not because of Brexit, or the Brexit should not be the main reason to do it. Certainly it offers a historical opportunity to do some internal reshuffling, change of focus, being more proactive in terms of approaching new markets and so on. But the analysis is rather based on the figures, on the potential and performance data from individual source markets. This is just the caveat that I would like to mention before going on. As I mentioned, there is a list of markets that I'd like to share with you today that would be of my focus for the upcoming period. First of all, the industry, the demand levels for English are culminating. So we have few markets to choose from when we look at the number of new students. So the growth within the industry is driven by few markets. That's the first kind of viewpoint that one needs to acknowledge when looking at where you want to be. The selection of the markets also features their global performance. So we took into account the number of student weeks spent historically, so the data that I shared at the start. Then we also look at the performance for the UK specifically, and what kind of market share also historically the UK has in these markets. We also look at the English language proficiency levels and the economic situation in these countries. Obviously there are a few more mentions that I would like to highlight, such as Mongolia or Nepal, which are sort of growing for other destinations such as Australia and Canada. Then the UK can also take note of, or some further countries within the ASEAN region. And I would still factor them into my kind of predictions, although I would categorize them as tier two markets at this point of their kind of development. I'd like to showcase some of the market profiles for these countries, why we think that these markets are worth looking at in the future. So I hope that you can see it, but as I said, the blue line depicts the total sending power of a market, so how many student weeks spend the students abroad, and then the development for the UK. So in this particular case, we see that Colombia is not growing for the UK, but it is growing globally year on year. Actually, the pace of growth has been accelerating over the last couple of years, which is also shown or demonstrated in the ranking of Colombia globally. So it became the 7th most important market, moving there from the 9th spot. And also, if you look at the English Proficiency Index, which is something that's published by the EF research team, we can see that the proficiency levels are still quite low. So there is need for improving English. So one of the fastest growing source markets globally, but we believe that the UK is not benefiting from the growth, which is also shown in the UK's market share. So it's not that the UK would not be tapping into the market or wouldn't in the past. It did, because it had quite a high share in Colombia. As you can see, 19% in 2014. Japan is another example of a market. It's a traditional, again, one of the more mature markets, well-established, long-standing agency tradition as well. If you look at the total size of the market, it becomes obvious that it's one of the must-be markets for the UK, because it shows significant potential year on year. So it's a relatively stable market with the need for English. Proficiency levels are a bit higher, but English abroad is still on demand. And we can see that in terms of its global ranking, it maintains the 3rd spot. On the other hand, and this was one of the reasons why we added Japan into the list, was that again, UK's market share has been on decline. So in the past, the UK did fare better in Japan than it fares now. Mexico is another market from the Latin American region. We see Latin America as one of the short-term and mid-term opportunities for the UK to increase their presence in the region and benefit from the growth that the market offers. It has been a bit of a shaky development, but for the UK, especially the last couple of years were years of decline, and we believe that this trend can be reversed, although there is a very strong preference of Mexican students to opt for Canada as their primary destination, also thanks to the geographical proximity. Vietnam is another market that we recommend to focus on. Vietnam and the ASEAN region in general is also one of the regions that the International Education Strategy recommends to focus on. And I might see that there are some synergies going into the future to approach this market, probably not on an individual basis, but to do sort of a joint marketing effort. I think that the UK could do more in terms of joint marketing activities. It's not only to be able to make a proper buzz, but it also save some costs to do joint events, joint marketing, and so on. And I reckon that this is going to take place not just on that English language sector scale, but also, as I mentioned, cross-sector opportunities will allow for more interaction with other sectors. So despite 18 being a negative year for Vietnam globally, we still think that the UK can leverage the overall market size, and on the other hand, its currently low presence in the market to gain more student weeks from the country. Thailand, as I mentioned on a number of occasions, not growing globally, but we see an appeal for the UK. There has been some growth recently. 17 and 18 posted positive development for the UK. And again, bearing in mind that the number of markets that post growth is quite limited, this would be one of the markets to look at. It might not pose, in terms of volume, such an opportunity that Japan or Colombia does, but it's still one of the markets to keep an eye on. And Brazil, established itself as the second largest market globally, with the current penetration levels at around 7%. We still that there is room for improvement. We saw some improvement after the English is Great campaign that was done in Brazil a few years back. Once it was done, we also did a quick engagement survey amongst Brazilian students, and we saw an interesting growing interest in the UK, which has also sort of translated into an influx of students into the UK the next year. So we believe that initiatives like this are really helping UK to become an option for Brazilian students wanting to learn English abroad. So that's one of the reasons why we think UK can and has to be more present in Brazil. And now over to the industry survey. So obviously Brexit and the topic of Brexit is creating a lot of buzz amongst agents, and together with English UK we thought that it would be good to have some fresh content for the session as well. So what I'm going to present is a survey. We've collected the responses last week, so it's really fresh from the oven, where we surveyed almost 200 agents about their perceptions on Brexit. And as a result, I'm able to share some of their concerns and some of the recent developments with you. So we received almost 200 responses, 194 from 50 countries. The split in between countries was rather balanced. We had slightly less responses from the EU region, but in terms of number of responses from these countries, you can see that the leaders were Western European countries. So the sample was rather balanced, some things which I was very pleased about, because it was a self-selected sample of agents given the time constraints. First question was whether the agents we surveyed noticed a change in demand for the UK in the run-up of Brexit. We specified that period for the last 6 months, and I'm not sure if you can see the results in the back. Can you just let me know if I should read it out loud or if you can see it? Okay. So the results were that we've broken the figures down to EU and non-EU countries to have a point of reference for both, because we saw that there were different patterns. Obviously, EU-based agents were more concerned, and 18% shared with us that they see much greater, this was for non-EU, that despite Brexit, 18% of agents from non-EU countries saw much greater interest in the UK, whereas only 1% of EU-based agents reported this kind of increase. When it comes to slightly greater interest in the UK, 10% of EU-based agents responded that they saw greater interest. Obviously, for the vast majority of agents, there was no change. So 39% of EU-based agents, no change, and 46% of non-EU agents. When it comes to the other end of spectrum, though, almost 50% of agents based in the EU region told us that they see fewer demand for the UK, which is something we are very keen on cross-referencing with the results of the Q3 survey, quick survey. So while we are in the process of validating the responses, we don't see a huge decrease. Again, I'm not 100% able to share the precise figure at this point, but for Q3, we are likely to see a slight decline for the UK. As a follow-up question, we asked the agents about how concerned are their customers with regard to Brexit. And naturally, again, agents based in EU region, their customer base were more worried about Brexit. As much as 2/3 of the agents based in the EU region showed signs of concern. We then introduced a number of true-false statements to see how agents would react to this. And the first one was that we asked them whether they think that Brexit will have, in the end of the day, no impact whatsoever, either positive or negative. And only 15% of agents from the EU region agreed with this, while 1/3 of agents based outside EU thought that Brexit will have no impact. So everyone in the industry is sort of bracing for Brexit. Again, these are rather perceptions or market sentiment about it, but it says how much of an attention are agents devoting to the topic of Brexit. Now, I think what's really, really important, one of the key takeaways, was that we asked them whether they will increasingly promote English language courses in other destinations. And you can see that the staggering proportion of 82% of EU-based agents told us that they would do so. Moreover, some of them already indicated that they are looking to increase the number of partnerships with providers from other destinations. Whereas in case of non-EU based agents, it was only 60%, still a high figure. And my reading would be that Brexit is also influencing the mindset of non-EU based agents. So when talking with them, I would extend the information that you provide to EU-based agents to make sure that these guys are on the same page as well. We also asked whether they think that Brexit will have an impact on education-related funding for courses in the UK. This was the strongest response that we received towards agree or yes. So as much as 90% of all agents in the EU region believed so, whereas 73% of agents based outside of EU thought so as well. In terms of having a perception of currency fluctuations and its possible impact, which we all know played a role back in 2017, 51% of agents told us that they believe that the UK will benefit from an accessible pound, and 68% of non-EU based agents believed so as well. So exchange rates are something to, again, look at going into the future. In terms of implementing new visa policies, agents believe that these are going to increase their costs. 80% of EU-based agents were being ready to acknowledge that there's going to be higher administrative costs for them. Interestingly enough, 59% of non-EU-based agents thought so too. In terms of other ELT destinations benefiting from Brexit, agents were very positive on this question as well. So especially EU-based agents, 87% of them shared that they think that especially Ireland and Malta will benefit from the post-Brexit scenario, whichever it will be. And 79% of all agents from non-EU countries were inclined to answer yes as well, which again stresses the need for a dialogue with agents, regardless of where they're based. And as the last statement, we were asked whether they think that students will be less interested in the UK as an English language destination. As you can see, 2/3 of the market, of the EU market, agreed with this statement. So Brexit is or has planted an idea in agents' mind that they need to also diversify from their point of view to look for other destinations that they could be promoting at the expense of the UK. Whereas in case of non-EU agencies, the percentage stood at 43%. Again, stresses the need for dialogue to be extended onto non-EU based agents. So just as a wrap-up, this was a market sentiment survey, so it doesn't tell you about the volume or the shift in the volume, the number of students and student weeks being spent, but it gives you a pretty accurate picture about what's happening in the agency market and how agencies perceive the upcoming change, what is their main concern, and probably it also outlines, what could be done, again, on a national level, on an association level, as well as on an individual provider level to mitigate the impacts of Brexit. And we also asked them, if have they changed anything in their strategy or what kind of actions they have taken to date when it comes to Brexit. I probably have to read this out loud, but the first option was whether they attended any market intelligence seminars or webinars related to Brexit. Interestingly enough, agents from non-EU countries reported on a much bigger scale that they have attended some webinars or seminars. We also asked if they do or have done any staff training when it comes to Brexit. And again, the number of responses we received from non-EU agents was higher than what we would normally anticipate, that EU agents would be much more proactive in doing training to their staff. When it comes to making business trips to other destinations, again, non-EU agents were reporting on a higher scale that they've done some business trips to other destinations. In case of EU-based agents, 17% of them confirmed that they made a trip to another destination. But the vast majority of agents stick to monitoring the media. So their stance in this, or their approach, has been mostly passive. So they expect that they will be able to learn more about the recent developments and especially implications for their agency through the media. The other point that you probably can't see is sending communication campaigns to their students. So in this area, EU agents were much more proactive than their non-EU counterparts, 29 instead of 11, or compared to 11%. And in terms of no activity, 1/4 of agents based in the EU haven't taken any action to date, which compares to 31% of agents from non-EU countries. Now, as a very last question, we also inquired about what could English UK as the National Peak Association could do to help the agencies in terms of better preparing for the post-Brexit scenario. This is an infographics that depicts the main keywords mentioned by agents, and the message is really clear that agents would predominantly welcome more information, more reliable, pertinent market intelligence, but also developments on the visa policies. So again, while there is a notion of how the process is going to look like, it seems that agents are not aware, and one of the most frequently used keywords was in fact visa regulations and updates. So agents are really seeking for more updates. It seems that the uncertainty at this point is worse than the notion of Brexit itself. It suggests that agents are not aware of possible consequences, and they're basing their business decisions on myths rather than facts. So this is my reading of the situation, that it's very important, even critical, to make sure that agents understand the facts about Brexit rather than being driven by the uncertainty. Moving on to a summary. When I was looking at what kind of opportunities or next steps individual providers can embark, I thought about categorizing them into imminent or short-term opportunities, mid-term opportunities, and then long-term or strategic goals or objectives that one needs to bear in mind. In terms of imminent opportunities, I still think that currency fluctuations are going to have a short-term impact for the UK in terms of attracting students. Availability of scholarships, something again that's very dynamic. There was just very recently a funding made available by the Hungarian government. I'm not sure if you heard about it, but language schools could opt to be registered on this program and receive funding from the government, which was paying both for school-related expenses, so tuition fees, accommodation and transfers, and also pocket money for students. So these kind of initiatives are distorting the market, and it will be increasingly important to take note of these as well. And of course, special promotions, time-limited opportunities with the key partners, which will also show them how valued they are to your organizations. In terms of midterm opportunities, I think that this is the time for more systematic structural changes done by providers. We also see consolidation taking place. We see more mergers and acquisitions. We see some important schools closing down. And we also see providers opening up new locations. So it's a very dynamic time that requires one to assess and to be more open to developing new markets and new channels. Some of the markets I already mentioned to you, where I would be focusing my efforts on. And in terms of developing new channels, it's also to go beyond the traditional agency platform, to look at what kind of peer-to-peer partnerships could be developed with high schools or even language schools in major source markets. For instance, there is a tradition being established in China where big language schools are partnering with language schools abroad, and they're offering studying English abroad as an extension, as an add-on to general English courses that they can study at home. And in terms of strategic goals, it's also important to take note of the existing crucial partnerships developed over the years, and from a more strategic point of view, to look at what could be done in terms of product development. What we see is a decline for general English. The growing English language proficiency means that students are able to learn, A1, A2, even B1 at homes. And if they decide to go abroad, they look for more sophisticated, more specialized courses with an added value, with access to labor skills that they won't be able to acquire otherwise, and so on. Courses that combine learning a foreign language with some local specifics, local nuances. So we also see more partnerships between language schools and their local destination marketing bodies. Again, doing some joint marketing efforts and so on. So I think this is the time to think outside the box and to look for more options which are there. They just need to be discovered. I think the key is to select the right markets and the right approaches. So, for instance, when we do consulting, we suggest bespoke strategies for each market. So one size fits all, again, is not the approach that you would like to take on. You need to differentiate between established and emerging markets, because, again, you will be dealing with different stage of maturity, meeting new partners, defining strategies how to vet new partners. You don't want to burn your marketing pounds on agents who are not reliable, especially in those emerging markets. What I also recommend is to break the source markets down into tiers. So while it might be well established in tier 1 cities, you need to look beyond that. And we already have Tier 4 cities in China, which are becoming emerging sources of students for international education. Something that I mentioned quite frequently was individual and joint marketing. You know, decide what's the best in terms of developing an itinerary for your institution to do a really bespoke roadshow meeting agents in their offices. It's not just that it's going to probably lead into more business, but it's a sign of respect to your partners. Whereas in other cases, it might be better if you embark on a joint trade mission or sales mission with peer institutions from the UK. There's this strong tradition or preference towards these kind of missions in Canada, but also in the US and Australia, where, you know, if there's a delegation of 20 language schools from one country, it's usually affiliated with having some sessions at the embassy. So agents are not only benefiting from cultivating the relationships with the providers, but also meeting embassy officials, which we all know they're very keen on talking to when they have a chance, and so on. So even if there is a consortia of language schools, it could be a loose group of schools that would like to do this kind of joint initiative. It's something that I would consider. And again, look at the quick data. You now have access to really bespoke and timely intelligence that will allow you to reassess and readjust now on a number of occasions throughout the year, so that you can back up your marketing and recruitment related investments and initiatives. Last but not least, communication. I think some response is better than no response. And I know from the talks with English UK that they've been doing a great deal of work in terms of making sure that agents and other partners understand the current situation and because of reduce the fear connected to Brexit. But the results of the agency survey really pointed out to the urgency of doing it even more frequently and even with more urgency. So if agents tell us that they're seriously considering looking at some options at the expense of the UK, I think it is time to act upon that indication. Probably on that note, we will end the session. I hope that it sparked more interest. I hope that it was useful for you. I will be around for a couple more minutes. If you have any questions or if you have any now, feel free to shoot. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, Patrik. Thank you once again, Jane from Wimbledon School of English. I was just wondering about Africa. You haven't really mentioned Africa. North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, and also other countries such as Angola. So 30 seconds. What are your thoughts on Africa as an emerging market?
From a data perspective, we've been looking into the market, but what we can tell is that few destinations still lag in terms of measuring the market, so we don't have enough solid evidence. You know, it would be rather what we hear from our partners that the region is becoming one, but we don't have any solid information in terms of what it would mean for the UK sector to tap into the market. From what we know, an important destination obviously is South Africa, which for instance attracts a lot of students from Angola. So we would have some intelligence on some of the leading markets, but again we would have some missing points in terms of having data on all 8 destinations to be able to demonstrate with the same level of confidence that yes, this is a very good market. But yes, we are hearing rather in the form of soft intelligence that the region is becoming an opportunity. I'm really sorry I couldn't answer in more details, but again, with the data limitations currently at hand.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. Do you have any data on online teaching?
It's a similar answer. Due to the lack of data, there are a few big providers, but there's no annual survey, not anything systematic that would be able to let us know. We've done some research in China last year, which confirmed that there is a really huge and booming online market in China, and in fact that Chinese students would rather prefer to learn English online or locally than going abroad, which was identified as one of the obstacles. So to generalize my answer, online market would be a disruptor in the industry. We wouldn't have like precise data on the size of the market, but in China it's quite significant.
Hannah from St. Giles International. I just wondered about your comments regarding Brazil. I'm a bit confused about why you highlighted that as a potential growth market, considering that the real's like super weak at the moment.
I'm sorry, could you please speak
no
a bit?
problem. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. No, I was a bit confused by your comments about Brazil being a potential emerging market.
Brazil?
Because the real is so weak, it's outweighed, the pound's weakness, and there's so much political upheaval within the country at the moment. So why have you highlighted that as a particular source, emerging market potentially for the UK?
So just to recap, so why we think that Brazil is a suitable market for the UK?
Why have you highlighted that as a potential growth market?
Okay, well, there's a long-standing tradition for Brazilian students to learn English abroad. Even back in the times where there was, science without borders and languages without borders, when Brazil was a really strong market. Now we don't have such a significant scholarship, but still the number of students and student weeks spent by Brazilian students is significant. And again, Brazil is the third largest market. Obviously, the UK is not the first choice, but we believe that if the UK does more marketing to students in Brazil, it will be able to do to increase its market share. So we saw Brazil growing recently, but we didn't see UK benefiting from that growth. Our past experience with doing this kind of big marketing initiatives in Brazil was positive too. So as I said, there was this English UK Great campaign. Lots of stakeholders were involved in that, even local players like BMI, and it did yield some results for the UK. So I believe there needs to be a concentrated or orchestrated effort by the ELT sector to make sure that you tap into Brazil. As I said, it offers potential, and there are more cities, coming out on the heat map of Brazil. So we're looking at some tier 2, tier 3 cities, which in the future are, going to allow for that kind of expansion. So we definitely see more potential, an appetite from within Brazil to learn English abroad. It's just to make the presence of the UK sound and to have the right product. Because obviously a lot of the mobility is connected to work rights, to the ability to work while learning English, which is something that's currently not possible to do in the UK. But we like to be open-minded. We think that in the future it might come to the point where students will be able to work, which is also the case of Malta, for instance. They just last year, I believe, they have announced that language travel students will be able to work if they spend a certain amount of student weeks, and probably in some time the UK will be more open to similar schemes that will allow certain nationalities to work. Again, there's a past experience of Australia by offering, working holiday visa makers a bespoke product. They were able to enlarge the student population in Australia enrolled in ELICOS courses. So there are options, probably not at this point, but we would not recommend omitting Brazil from your marketing focus.
You mentioned scholarships and funding and how it could skew markets. Do you mention that specifically in your reports, where it might apply?
Not specifically, but we reckon that this is a force that needs to be acknowledged. Although in the past there were much bigger, scholarship like the one in Brazil, like the one in Saudi Arabia, we still feel that there are in these kind of efforts and initiatives sponsored by local governments that UK ELT providers can tap into. We've done some research on the number of government-backed scholarship. This was back in 2013 or 14, I believe, we found 73 of such initiatives. I think that the number has now decreased rapidly, but maybe something to look at again. What kind of scholarships are available on the market? Again, we do not track this systematically. We usually come across these things on an ad hoc basis.
Hi, Tim, English UK. With the decline in the European markets that's happening over the years and possibly will continue with Brexit, some schools' response, particularly those who don't have strong agent relationships, will be to look more direct and invest more in the direct channels, with agents also losing perhaps the number of schools they're working with if their own market's declining and they're looking to other markets. There's going to be more of a move towards that. Is there any sense in the stats of that developing, maybe not with the UK, but with other markets, anywhere where that mobility trend has changed from agents to direct?
Not so much. If you look at the developments in, for instance, Australia and Canada, and bear in mind these destinations are reliant on agents, especially Australia, due to the location, of course. We don't see the agent's role diminishing. We see that agents maintain their role. One of the references you can look at within the UK perspective would be the Quick Report, where I think Q2 2019 depicted that 77% of all student weeks were recruited by agents. So still, it's quite significant for the UK too. What could be interesting for you as well is to look at these references. Maybe there will be some notion about agency performance data. As you probably know, the Australian government has pushed forward an initiative that agency performance data will be made available. I think it will be only made available to providers, but there might be some further information about that. And also, agents are important as, again, source of mobility of students in terms of pathway students. So pathway students tended to use agents in greater proportion than normally. So there's a lot of data on that segment too. But when we've compared, for instance, the situation in international education to general tourism, we saw travel agencies and their role diminish quite significantly. We saw online bookings growing 2 times faster than bookings through travel agents, which is something that we didn't see in this industry. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. You still use agents in markets where the visa processing is challenging for students. Like, they want to make sure that they do not get burned on this, or where they want to use the agency advice, like which school to choose from. Also, some countries are afraid to pay to schools directly. They want to have a local person to turn to. So there are reasons why agents. I don't think that their role is gonna diminish. Maybe, but it's not going to be a significant downward trend, in my opinion.
Done for questions?
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks again.